Welcome everyone. I'm going to put some links into the chat. Just put in one right now. We're going to start by talking just a little bit about frameworks, since it was a topic that came up when we first were meeting and discussing things that we'd like to talk about. And one of the topics that people had raised was talking about frameworks. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And go ahead and go to our catalog. And I have to confess, I only ever use the default framework. I know that lots of libraries do use different frameworks for different formats and for different reasons. And a very good reason to do that is because you can make certain fields mandatory. One thing that I do most often with our default framework is minor edits. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate that, since it's something that I think can be rather intimidating, but is actually pretty easy as long as you're very, very careful. So we go into Koha administration, MARC bibliographic framework, and I haven't edited or changed any of these other frameworks. I tend to just really use the default framework. We're an OCLC library, and the records that I bring in from OCLC are always in this default framework. And then we look at the MARC structure. And I'm going to go ahead and do show all. And one thing that I've been wanting to change is under the 040. Let me move this a little bit. And under actions, to edit in the framework, we actually go to view subfields or edit subfields. I always like view subfields, because I can then take a look, and the edit that I've been interested in making is the subfield E, description conventions. It's not mandatory, but under RDA, I've been wanting to prompt myself to include it. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that. And make it mandatory. It's that easy. If I wanted to not show it or show it, that would be done in here. And one thing that's really powerful with the frameworks is they can be linked to authorized values. I haven't played around with this. Simply save changes. And then when I'm creating a new record or editing, if I try to save it, it's going to tell me that all these fields are mandatory and I have to fill them in. And in the basic editor, it's nice because it gives you these little yellow or these things that it's required, etc., etc. I'm going to back out because I don't want to do a whole record right now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. Does anyone have any questions or comments related to frameworks that they'd like to share? before we move on to our next topic? Well, if anyone thinks of anything, bring it up. We had some questions submitted ahead of time, and I'm going to go ahead and put those in the chat. So we can start chatting about those. Please feel free to unmute, and if you're comfortable sharing your video, go ahead and let's chime in. The first question was, I know what cutter numbers are and how to build them. Can anyone tell me why I would want to use them in favor of the author's names? This question comes from a specialized research library doing original cataloging on about a third of the items. Well, from my perspective, using a cutter creates an original, unique call number on the book. It can really save time in paging materials and looking for materials on the shelf. One of the classic examples is, say you have books on the Smith family history by Amy Smith, Smith family history by Fergus Smith, and Smith family history by Penelope Smith and Petunia Smith and Roger Smith. Book spines are usually very, very brief. So on the spine of the book, all of these might just say Smith family by Smith. Maybe they don't even say by Smith. So when you're shelving those books, you're going to have to pause and look at them if you're shelving them by author. Say they've just got, CC 285 because you have, and then that's all is on the call number label because you haven't done cutters. You have to pause and take a look at the book in order to get it shelved by author in the right sequence. Then when somebody's looking for the book, there's going to be a pause because there's not a lot of information on the spines about which is the one that people want by Penelope Smith or Fergus Smith. That takes time. Granted, it doesn't take much time in a small collection, but when you're paging and reshelving books, it does slow things down. Another reason for doing full cutter numbers and call numbers in books on the shelf is that it is the nature of collections to grow. A collection may be small right now, say just a few thousand items, so that this isn't an issue. Say you've got unique authors by every, under every topic. And so maybe you do just have the alphanumeric sequence of an LC call number or a beginning Dewey number, and you haven't taken the time to do cutter numbers. But the nature of collections is to grow. And as you get more books in a subject area, you will have, again, very brief spine information. Shelving them by author is going to take more time. Paging them just by author's last name is going to take more time. And as collections grow, it's very, very typical for a library to realize we've got to flesh out those call numbers, we've got to flesh out those cutter numbers in order to make unique call numbers to save us time in paging books and shelving books. And going back to reclassify a book takes more time than doing that cutter number in the first place. Editing records takes more time than just typing it in. Because when you're going to go change the call number on a book, you've got to change where you wrote it, you've got to change the spine number label, you've got to change maybe an 050 and an 090 field or an 082, you got to change it in the item record. That takes more time than simply really doing a cutter number in the first place. So these are some reasons that I've learned over the years and that I've heard for when you're classifying a book, doing the full shelf listing, even though it's a small collection. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to chime in about reasons for doing full cutter numbers or not?
Okay. First of all, I apologize for being late. I was teaching evidence-based practice searching across the street.
All right. We don't award demerits for lateness.
Oh, good. And I was outside in DC in August, which isn't helping my asthma. So we use the National Library of Medicine system, and NLM has stopped doing cutter numbers. They just give a year and probably a numeric accession number. So I've been using, anyone remember these?
Oh, yeah.
But I figure in our collection, we have a few thousand, and we really ought to weed a few hundred. As long as I'm close-ish, I don't have to be exact. But yeah, I do try to put in cutter numbers. I have a list of libraries that actually use NLM and have public catalogs. And I go out and harvest them. But I'm not an expert. But again, small collection, good enough.
Definitely. I mean, one of the purposes of the cutter is to just be unique and to get the book somewhere in the right place so that someone doing a virtual shelf browse in the catalog will come across books on the same subject.
Yeah, see, koha doesn't check for duplicate, say 060Bs, do they? Does it?
I do not believe so.
Yeah, I didn't think so. So I probably have a few duplicates, but as I once said in the koha list, if you're part of the cataloging department, these things really matter. If you are the cataloging department and the sysadmin and the tech services department and a third of the reference department, yeah, not quite so much. Whereas Bob Newhart said, explaining why he failed as an accountant, I figured if you got it within a few bucks, it's okay. Now I'll be quiet for a while. I need to eat my lunch.
Enjoy. Well, does anybody else have any thoughts related to call numbers, cutters, shelf listing? Well, feel free to chime in should anything come up. Another question we received ahead of time is about the MARC fields in the 6XX series and spaces. There's subfields V form, subfield X general. Definitions can be found online, but couldn't find anything that says what makes a given term a form rather than a general or topical entry. Looking at LC records, I see no consistency. Things like biography or various placed in either. Is there a list? Yes, there is a list. Let me put some links in the chat. I'm going to go get those. Lists of free-floating subdivisions that can be used on almost any heading, if it makes sense, and if it's allowed, can be found as PDF files on the Library of Congress website, and also as a PDF is a section from the Library of Congress Subject Headings Manual on form and topic subdivisions and all other kinds of subdivisions. So there are some freely available lists. And there is no consistency because the subfield V is new. It used to be that everything was a subfield X, whether it was about something or was something. Then subfield V was introduced. And so you got, and you still have lots of records, for example, that are biographies. So should, under the current rules, have subfield V biography. But were cataloged a long time ago when we only had subfield X biography. And the rule of thumb is subfield V form, is it that thing? Or subfield X topic, is it about that thing? A shorthand for remembering these that I tell people, my interns, my volunteers, is V sounds like F, form, it's form, V for form. X, topics, it's about the thing. So biography is one of the classic examples. Is it a biography or is it about biography? Is it telling you about writing biographies? Then it's going to be a subfield X. Or is it a biography of someone? Then it's going to be subfield V form. Novels, fiction is another classic thing. Is it fiction or is it about fiction? And another thing that comes up with these is the order of the subdivisions. It's generally topic, place, chronology, form. Form is usually the last. And I haven't found a good way to manage this except you just have to learn it. Topic, place, chronology, form. When I'm working with my interns, we will go over this and go over this, sometimes for days. They'll come in and I was like, what's the order of subdivisions? Here we go. Topic, place, chronology, form. Topic, place, chronology, form. Cha, cha, cha. Topic, place, chronology, form. Sometimes we just write it, put it on the wall. So a classic example would be something like dogs, then topic, history, place, California, chronology, 20th century, form, indexes. That order is generally true, usually true, but there are exceptions. Some free-floating subdivisions are subdividable geographically, which means that the geographic subdivision should come after that. And the geographic subdivision may not then meet that exact order, but generally that subfield V is the last one. Does anybody have any thoughts about subdivisions that they'd like to chime in with? One thing I've noticed particular to Koha is that when your bibliographic record has the Texas People Crave and something beginning with F. I like that, Fred. Fries? French fries? There we go. Texas People Crave French fries. I've noticed that Koha will not match or link the authority record with the heading in a bib record if that heading in the bib record has one of these free-floating subdivisions. It's perfectly valid. Say dogs, subfield X history, but unless you've got an authority record that's dogs, subfield X history, it won't link that. That's something that I am aware of in our catalog, but I haven't yet addressed because I'm still cleaning up our authority file. I'm still dealing with all those main headings. So does anybody have anything they'd like to chime in with related with Koha, authorities, linking, headings? Any other topics? Oh, here we go. We have some things in the chat. What are my thoughts about books? Copyright and published say 2001, but the verso says second printing 2002. Do we go with the latest date, even though it's a second printing, or do you go with 2001 because it's copywritten and published? And that is a very typical question. Fred says authority file, something's going to deal with any day now. We're here for you when you do, Fred. Yes, good point. The 008 permits multiple dates. I would say it depends on your collection. In special collections and rare collections, there can be great concern about different printings, and we do want to account for that in the cataloging records. There are, if you have access to AACR2 or RDA, there are rules about when do you consider something to be a different edition or not with the printing date. And I think the Library of Congress has published a position statement on that. I'll see if I can, or what we used to call Library of Congress rule interpretations. I can see if I can pull that up. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. I'm not getting that right away. I will look for that and send it out to people. It's a very helpful document because it talks about the different changes to decide whether or not these are a different edition. You typically look at things like, is there any statement with that printing date that indicates that it's been revised or changed in any way? Like, does it say a corrected printing, a revised printing? You also look at the title page, see if there are any differences. You look at the pagination. The pagination can be very important in discovering if there's been changes in the text. So are there exactly the same numbers of page sequences, like, preliminary paging, the main paging, like, does paging still IV, comma, 382 pages? Then you can spot check. Is page 17 the same? Sometimes you don't have another copy of the book to double check. It's not a question of whether is this copy true or not. So you're simply looking at a cataloging record and say, well, does this match in these areas? Another thing you take into account is there a different ISBN? Publishers are notorious for assigning the same ISBN to changed editions, so that's not necessarily a definitive indicator, but again, it's evidence. And this is often a place where OCLC or worldcat.org is a great help, because you can look at different records that might show up different paging with different publication dates. And it's an area of cataloging where it does become more of an art than a science. What's your gut feeling? Is the binding different? So if there's only one of those changes, like a different cover, but everything else is the same, probably another copy of the same edition. If there's a few very different things, like they've got different covers, the paging is the same, but it's just looking very different, it might feel like it's a different edition. The most important thing I would say is to describe it as specifically as possible. And then, yes, you can use different dates. I think it's in the 008, you can put a T for copyright, and publication date. If it really feels like a different edition according to all these criteria, but it doesn't say that it was, it just says, say, 2001 is the publication date, but it's got more pages, you can always put a different publication date in brackets in your 264 field. Say bracket 2002, and then explain it in a note. Say, or you can put the copyright date in a 264, indicator 4, subfield C, copyright 2001, and then put in a note calling attention to the fact that this is a later edition.
Also kind of depends on the nature of the work. Let's say a medical text, if it's a second printing because they just ran out of them, it's one thing. If it's a second printing because on page 784, they said IV strychnine instead of IV saline, which could be significant in patient outcome. Then that's definitely worth mentioning. And I don't know, would that be a second corrected printing, or would that word a whole new edition just because that edition is kind of permanently tainted as deadly? And I suppose you want to talk about books printed on demand, let's say copyright 2015, but some were printed for this class in 2016 and 18 and 20.
It's a completely similar issue. For the first instance, I would put in a 250 in brackets and say something like corrected edition, or corrected printing even. Books, there's some really good guidelines. Let me go see if I can find those about printed on demand that OCLC has put forth. Does anyone else want to chime in while I'm going off and looking for a link? Let's see. Yeah, and in the chat, print on demand with constant changes, the best way to identify such books from the publisher's end. Yeah, liberal use of the 250 in brackets. And again, like, yeah, there we go. Good suggestion, Fred. Printed with revisions in YYYY. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we're already putting the exact date of printing in each one. I'm just hoping for suggestions about the best way to make this happen. Trying to take pity on my fellow catalogers.
Yeah, because if they do revisions each time, that's going to be really tricky. What kind of books are they printing? Is it something where the previous edition or previous information in a previous printing is dangerous?
Not dangerous. One example is we have a book on a guide to orders of chivalry, and we make changes to each chapter whenever the orders change their substance or go out of business or relocate or make some other major change. And these come in kind of randomly, and we are trying to keep up with it.
You have, say, a note saying, brackets, disbanded in 2019 or moved in 2020? Well, can you tell that there was a revision?
Yeah, it's a it's a process of constant upheaval and amendment. You're talking about probably 150 to 200 independent nonprofits, and if you've worked in any nonprofit, you know how volatile that can be.
When there are things like that are constantly being issued, I sometimes put them on a made-up serial record. Or, you know, if it's important that they each are retained, and just, you know, put the issue dates, that sort of thing, and they're used separately because things change. Because if you have so many different monograph records for the different editions, that doesn't necessarily help the user find what they're looking for.
Yeah, the challenge is that back issues would not be available, and some of them, some editions might only go out in 3 or 4 copies. So I recognize that this is going to be a monster to deal with, but I'm trying to ease the pain as best I can.
Yeah. There are also records and models for constantly updated and changing monographs. So I put a link in the chat to OCLC's Special Cataloging Guidelines. Section 3.1.2 is photocopies and print-on-demand reproductions. So I found those very helpful. We get a lot of print-on-demand books because it's a very specialized history. Sometimes it's a self-published account of a relative's voyage that we have in our library, or even a novel. Oh yeah, we have a good contribution in the chat. Serials record is also good to remind us to buy the monographic serials and then catalog each volume separately to see the contents notes. Exactly. You can have the serial record just for tracking, purchasing, checking in, and tracking the holdings, and then go ahead and do a monographic record, either as an analytic or just a monograph record with the 7XX linking fields, if you want. Or the series. If it's a truly monographic series, it'll link on the 800 fields, 8XX fields.
And do you feel that's preferable to analytical links?
I think it depends on how your catalog is functioning with the linking, how the serials, the series works. Ours works really well. And how you would be using in acquisitions and acquiring such a serial record for checking and receiving in the holdings.
Yeah, we do very little of that, but maybe a quarter of our collection is genealogies, and almost all of those are self-published, which is just a delight.
Yeah, the cataloging rules are generally written for a standard. And if something is self-published, it's often very non-standard and very creative to try to find out who would you call the publisher, and we use, I think it's the 037 field extensively for the information about how to purchase copies of the book and where is it from.
Yeah, too many of them are published in a run of 50 copies passed out to members of the family. This is why I'm doing so much original cataloging.
Yeah, yeah, we have things a bit like that going back 19th century and before too, because they were privately printed back then and a very small circulation. Well, does anybody else have any other things they'd like to talk about this month?
Well, I'm trying to think up an excuse to mention Hinman collator to determine points, but it's probably not germane to this month's topic. More fun than
It doesn't have to be germane.
not even. Sorry.
No problem, Fred.
I suppose if you really wanted to get pedantic, could discuss points versus revisions, but that's probably more in the rare book area.
Yes.
I would say that if a book was reprinted to correct a point, I would be less inclined to mention that than to correct something dangerous.
Well, again, it depends on the nature of your collection, the nature of the revision.
Your collection, sure, I'd mention it.
Yeah, since we're a museum library, we tend to mention a lot of things that would be considered insignificant minutiae in most other collections.
But that's the fun stuff, the insignificant minutiae.
And it's quite rewarding when someone comes in to research that or requests a scan. Like, yes. Well, if there's nothing else, I think I'll go ahead and end the recording.